Outside of Taranaki, Kingi was not receiving a lot of direct support, but Taranaki iwi and Ngāti Rauanui had been early supporters of Te Ātiawa. While Hapurona gathered the Te Ātiawa forces near the Waitara River to the east of New Plymouth, the allied iwi massed to the west of the Pākehā town. The government forces were split. The bulk of the professional soldiers were at Waitara, while New Plymouth itself was defended by militia and volunteers for the most part. After the fighting at Te Kohia, the focus shifted to the west of New Plymouth. Most of the settlers had evacuated their homes and were sheltering inside New Plymouth. The Maori quickly began looting the abandoned homes and farms. 2 companies of the 65th Regiment marched on their camp in an attempt to protect the property of the settlers, but they were too few to attack the Maori camp, and after they withdrew, the looting continued. In fact, it increased as more Maori quickly arrived to take part in the war. The Maori population had been ready and waiting for this conflict, since they believed that Gore Brown had declared war on them the previous month. On the 26th of March, an important threshold was crossed. The Maori moved their camp to a more aggressive position on the hill at Waireka. While this was happening, smaller groups spread out to continue pillaging, but on this day they encountered civilians. 5 settlers, 3 men and 2 boys, were killed in 2 separate incidents. These murders would become a driving motivation behind the government war effort, but for now the government's focus was on protecting the remaining settlers. There was a small group of Pākehā settlers that continued to live at Waireka. This group was centred around the Reverend Gilbert and families of French and Portuguese settlers. These people were safe. The Maori considered that priests were sacred and that they were at war with the British, not all Europeans. A number of chiefs placed a notice on the door of the Reverend's house. Listen all the tribe. The road to our minister must not be trodden upon. Also the road to his friend James, who is from the Kihi, to Emmanuel, who is Portuguese, to his children and wife, to Tue, with his wife and children, who are French. Let the thought be light of these 3 tribes to their farms, to their property. Let it be light, because the word has gone forth from Paratene, Hoani and Kingi, Paringa, to these people, that we must strictly preserve them. Let there be no mistake. With us, the 3 tribes of Taranaki, Ngāti Rauanui and Ngāti Rauru, let it be light, that is all. However, the government was not aware of this protection, and Gore Brown and Colonel Gold decided that an expedition needed to be sent to rescue these settlers. At 2 p.m. on the 28th of March, the Pākehā forces went out in 2 columns. Lieutenant Colonel Murray led the main force of 88 soldiers and 28 sailors along the main road from Omata, while a flanking force of 160 volunteers and militia commanded by Captain Brown advanced along the beach with the intention of marching up the Waireka Creek and rescuing the settlers, while the Imperial forces engaged the Taranaki and Ngāti Rauanui forces. Shortly afterwards, a further detachment of 60 sailors followed Murray along the main road. But the government's intelligence was poor. They misplaced the location of the main raider camp. They believed it had been established at Whalers Gate between New Plymouth and the Omata Stockade, rather than its actual location at Waireka beyond the Omata Stockade. They were also uncertain of the size of the forces opposed to him. The official estimate was 460, but there were much larger figures going around New Plymouth, possibly as much as 800 warriors. In reality, even 460 is probably an overestimate. Murray's column reached Whalers Gate and found it unoccupied. To use Murray's own phrasing, I accordingly moved on leisurely with a view to sooner meeting Captain Brown, but on reaching the top of a hill about a quarter of a mile on this side of the Omata, the sound of rapid firing about 2 miles off and towards the sea made it evident that the volunteers were hotly engaged. The settler force had planned to climb off the beach well in the rear of Maori defences, but instead as they climbed up the gorge where the Waireka stream entered the sea, they realised they were only a mile from a pa on the hills above the stream. This pa was called Kaipopo and was not a true fighting pa, it was more of a camp with a palisade and some rifle pits for protection. The settlers climbed the gully as the Maori force left the camp to engage them. The settlers occupied defensive positions in the gorge and engaged the Maori in a long-range firefight. It seems likely that both sides in this engagement believed their opponents were attempting to encircle them, and were focused on preventing this from happening. Captain Brown believed that he was surrounded on 3 sides, and that the Maori were particularly eager to block his line of retreat to Maori's forces. Although I haven't found a reliable account from the Maori perspective, it seems that they had seen Maori's force to their front, and were simply seeking to hold Brown's force at their rear left to allow the warriors to withdraw with their loot from the settler farms. On hearing the gunfire, Murray detached about 25 soldiers and all 28 sailors to go to Brown's aid, while the remainder of his force advanced on Kaipopo Pa. He intended to march around the hill and join the settlers, but his force also came under long-range fire from the hill and the gorge. Murray also believed that he was in danger of being outflanked, and his response was to hold his force near the main road and return fire with rifles and rockets. The force he had attached reached Brown with no problem, and they occupied some high ground above the gorge to keep the line of retreat to Murray's column open, while the militia attempted to keep the Maori skirmishers back. However, it was starting to get dark, and Murray did not want to be outside of the New Plymouth fortifications at night. He ordered the detachment back to his main force so that he could withdraw back to New Plymouth. Captain Brown saw the professional soldiers leaving their positions on the high ground, and he started ordering the settler forces back into a defensible position centred around an abandoned farmhouse. So far, the battle had been an indecisive skirmish, with all parties seemingly believing themselves to be in imminent danger of being encircled and destroyed, and as such limiting themselves to long-range and largely ineffective fire. But around 5:30, the 60 sailors that had been bringing up the rear arrived at the battle. Their leader, Captain Cracroft, saw it was almost dark and resolved to launch an attack on the pa before it was too late. I accordingly planted the 24-pounder rocket tube about 700 yards from it, and after a few discharges the men stormed this pa under a heavy fire in the most gallant style, William Odgers, leading seaman, doing duty as a coxswain, being the first man in it, and having captured the flags and destroyed everything alive in the trenches as far as could be ascertained in the dark, I returned to the blockhouse. During this assault, only 4 sailors were wounded, and Cracroft estimated that his force had killed at least 16 Maori in the assault. After this attack, he followed after Murray, who had already begun to withdraw to New Plymouth. Captain Brown and the settler force did not withdraw with them. Brown did not want to risk a retreat until after the moon had set and it was pitch black, especially since at the time his force was running out of ammunition and had a handful of wounded and 1 dead body to look after. Eventually the settlers withdrew after scouts found the area free of Maori and reached New Plymouth after midnight. If you were wondering about the settlers and the rescue attempt, they seem to have been forgotten as soon as the shooting started. The next day, 20 Maori on the government side set out to check on them and found that Reverend Brown and the other settlers to be perfectly fine and the battlefield abandoned. The settlers had watched the battle from their houses and had received regular updates on progress from passing Maori. However, they decided to now also travel to New Plymouth to prevent a second rescue attempt. The Battle of Waireka was played up as a huge success for the colonial forces and a decisive defeat for the Maori amongst colonists. The Taranaki Herald reported that 50 or 60 Maori were killed, and estimated the casualty count to between 100 or 150. This later figure was picked up by other newspapers, even in Britain, as 150 Maori killed in this battle. The Herald also published a long list of all the chiefs killed in the battle, 11 in total, including the paramount chiefs of both Ngāti Rurunui and the Taranaki iwi. This was contrasted against 2 dead and 14 wounded on the government side. In the settlers' eyes, the victory only failed to be a decisive, almost war-winning victory because of the lack of aggression shown by Colonel Murray, and to a lesser extent the poor planning of Colonel Gold. William Odgers, the first attacker into the camp, was promoted and awarded the Victoria's Cross for his bravery at the battle. However, this was not an accurate account of the battle. The total Maori dead is not known, but it is likely to have been between 20 and 30 dead, with about the same number wounded. James Bellich in the New Zealand Wars gives a low figure of 3, 1 outside the pa and 2 fighting the settlers in the gully. However, there were numerous contemporary accounts giving higher figures. Reverend Gilbert, who was one of the settlers who was supposed to be rescued in this battle, describes Maori coming to him during the battle and naming 2 of the dead and saying there were many more. Captain Brown estimated 30 dead the day after the battle. William Catherington saw the Maori forces march past his house and saw 17 dead, although he said that others had been buried on the battlefield. Government patrol about a week later found shallow graves with 6 dead inside that they then reburied. 2 days after the battle, the Reverend Riemann Schneider met with the retreating Maori forces and they claimed 16 to 20 dead and about 20 wounded. It seems likely that a large number of these casualties happened as a result of Cracroft's attack. What seems to have happened is that when the Maori observed Murray's forces retreating, a number of the older men went to the pa to begin cooking a meal and possibly discuss the next course of action. When Cracroft's force jumped the palisade, they coincidentally did so at the point where these elders had gathered. A number of these men were killed. Because of the age of these men, the casualties fell disproportionately onto the leadership of the iwi. On balance, Waireka was a victory for the government, but not as major as the newspapers believed. The Maori took more casualties, and those casualties fell disproportionately on the leaders of the iwi as a consequence of Cracroft's assault, and they did put Taranaki and Ngāti Rurunui on the defensive for a number of months. It also stopped the raids on the farms west of New Plymouth for a time, and ended the immediate threat to the town. But this battle would also come to be influential in New Zealand culture. It was used as an example of the incompetent and uncaring British officer leaving the brave New Zealand soldiers to stand alone against overwhelming odds. This would become a theme in New Zealand, and Waireka was a key example of this, at least until the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. But that lies outside the scope of the series. The government may have had a victory to crow about, but the situation was still poor in New Plymouth. While the threat to the west of the town had been driven away, Hapuruna and Kingi's forces had entrenched themselves up the Waitara River from the British encampment. A standoff developed there with the two forces working on their fortifications and occasionally scouting missions. Tamati Teto, known as a prophet, launched a raid into the bell block between Waitara and New Plymouth, burning a number of Pākehā homes, but Kingi disavowed his actions and made it clear that he would not support further attacks on Pākehā property. Despite this, most of the Pākehā population of Taranaki province were at this point refugees in New Plymouth, and the infrastructure available was struggling to cope with the increased numbers. To help cope, many people were evacuated to other settlements to ease the pressure, but the decrease in civilian population over the rest of the year was more than compensated by the increase in the number of soldiers stationed in the town. To feed all these people, the military forces in New Plymouth switched focus in April. They were now tasked with bringing in the harvest. Potatoes, wheats and other crops were ripe and untended and would soon rot if left alone. A number of armed parties sent out to bring in whatever crops they could to alleviate the potential for hunger in the town. Other than that, the only military action in the weeks after Waireka was the HMSS Niger bombarding a pa at long range to little effect. However, the government was building up strength in New Plymouth. Elements of the 12th and 40th Regiment, previously stationed in Australia, began arriving along with more artillery, marines and engineers. However, the governor's main concern was with the Kingitanga. The Hui and the Waikato had not happened yet, and Gore Brown was very worried that the King movement would join the war on Kingi's side. He returned to Auckland to organise the militia and other defences. He was also keen to use diplomacy to keep the Kingitanga neutral. This didn't go as planned, but he sent Maclean to the second Hui to try to convince the Kingitanga not to get involved. He realised that any further military actions in Taranaki were likely to generate sympathy for Kingi amongst Maori, so on the 20th of April he ordered Colonel Brown to suspend offensive operations against Wiremu Kingi. However, Gold was still allowed to attack Ngāti Ruanui in Taranaki. On April the 20th, Gold led a large expedition against Ngāti Ruanui in Taranaki. The core of this force was 500 soldiers of the 65th Regiment, supported by a 150-strong naval brigade, 60 volunteers, 4 6-pounder cannons, and 2 24-pounder howitzers, along with artillerymen and engineers. The objective of this expedition was to advance to Te Kohia, a small Pākehā settlement that had been abandoned before the war, and although well within Taranaki territory, had remained unlooted to this point. The force arrived at Te Kohia unmolested, and on the 21st the bulk of the force began working to bring in the wheat that had been abandoned in the fields. The naval brigade set out to search for the Taranaki forces that were presumably readying for battle. They eventually found the Maori forces gathering at Tatui Nikau Pa, inland of Waileatea. They kept an eye on the Taranaki force while occupying themselves wrecking a mill. After a few days harvesting, the entire colonial force advanced nearer to the pa at Waileatea. However, this pa was much stronger than at Waireka. It had a double line of heavy palisades with rifle pits and had swampy ground and forest to the south and west of the pa, making it difficult to encircle and limiting the attacking options for the British forces. Colonel Gold thought that an attack on the pa would be costly, and most of the defenders would escape into the forest, so he did not attack. Instead, he ordered the village of Waileatea destroyed, along with a nearby empty pa. The expedition then advanced further up the coast to the village of Wailea. Here, a few people were observed moving in the village, and they were said to have fired on the colonial soldiers. In response, 3 of the cannon were unlimbered and fired into the village before the naval brigade advanced and burnt every building except the church. The crops in the surrounding fields were either harvested and taken or destroyed. The colonial force then withdrew back to Waileatea, burning another village and an abandoned pa, taking a number of horses and cows, and destroying any waka or crops they found. 200 soldiers remained as a garrison at Tairomaka to protect the property of the settlers from reprisals. This expedition was destructive to the Taranaki iwi. Although they don't seem to have killed anyone directly, the destruction of housing and crops at the end of autumn would have led to a degree of hunger and hardship for the people of the iwi. However, the expedition was not seen in this way by the people of New Plymouth. The settlers were already disappointed with the leadership of the military forces in Taranaki. The failure at Te Kohia, the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Murray at Waireka, and now the failure of the expedition to Walia to engage with the enemy and deliver a victory led to an increased level of discomfort in the town. To make matters worse, Gore Brown continued to disallow offensive operations against Wiramukingi. At the end of May, the Taranaki Herald wrote, "It would seem, then, that the governor has no intention to urge on the course of events faster than suits his adversary's habits. We have our own opinions on the impolicy of the course, but we are most desirous that if it is not allowed to modify it for the better, it may not have less than fair play. To us, here, delay is to the last degree harassing. We are subjected to trials far greater than that of pressing danger by the total disorganization of our ordinary habits." However, the next month passed relatively uneventfully. Wiramukingi and Hapuruna fortified themselves near Huirangi, now joined by the party of Ngāti Maniapoto under Epiha Tokuhihi. Taranaki iwi was still concentrated at Tatui Nikau Pa, while the colonial government had stockades at Te Tairomaka, Omata, Bellblock, Waitara, and around New Plymouth. The only engagement was an ambush where a settler serving as a major was seriously wounded. However, in early June the war started up again at Waitara. First there was a raid on the Bellblock, with Maori burning more houses. Around the same time, Hapuruna started building a new pa, slightly south of Te Kohia, where he had fought in March. This was on top of a small ridge called Onukukaitara. It had gullies in front and behind it, limiting the directions an attack could come from. It was fairly easy to approach the Onukukaitara from the east and west. The east was a bit more difficult since the two gullies were close together at this end, and an attack from this direction would have to climb the nearby hill of Puketakauere before reaching the pa. Puketakauere had an old fortification on top of the hill as well, but the palisades had long since fallen down, and no work had been done on repairing it. Onukukaitara was built with a heavy palisade and deep trenches to allow defenders to survive an artillery bombardment. Major Nelson was the commander of the British forces at Waitara, which now largely consisted of the newly arrived 40th Regiment. He was very eager to attack this new pa, but Gore Brown would not allow it. Over the previous months, Gore Brown had written to Gold 5 times instructing him not to attack Kingi without provocation. The most recent of these was sent on the 6th of June and was very clear. "I have consulted with Mr. McLean, who has returned from Waikato, and my Executive Council, and although all see the inconvenience attending the present state of inaction, we are unanimously of opinion that any movement against William King at the present movement, without further aggression on his part, would probably involve war with nearly the whole of the tribes on the south of Auckland. I beg, however, to repeat that if the Chief William King renews his attacks upon you or the settlers, you are relieved from all restraints on my part, and will, I trust, deal with him vigorously and without delay. There is no political reason which can induce me to enjoin forbearance towards the Ngāti Rurunui and Taranaki tribes. On the contrary, it is necessary for our own credit that they should be severely punished in order that other tribes may learn that they cannot murder our unarmed settlers with impunity." Major Nelson set about convincing Gold that the necessary provocation had been obtained. On the 7th he wrote to Gold claiming that 250 shots had been fired from Onukukaitara. However, this was almost 2 kilometres away and well outside the effective range of Maori firearms. He then wrote to Gold describing how the work on the pa was progressing, with the workforce growing to 200 people fortifying the pa by the 18th. On the 23rd, Nelson was finally given an opportunity to create a provocation. Some Maori were observed gathering wood from a swamp near the boundary of the land that the government had claimed to have purchased. If they were felling trees on the government's land, it could be made out as an offensive measure. An engineer officer was sent out with an escort of 8 friendly Maori, including Te Tera Manuka, to precisely locate where the felled trees were coming from. He found the stumps of trees, confirmed they were on the land the government claimed, and as they left, the group was fired upon. Nelson said they received 3 shots before they returned fire, but the firefight was quickly ended when Nelson had his artillery fire on the Maori positions. With the necessary provocation obtained, plans started being made for an attack on Onukukaitara. Another 180 soldiers and 2 guns were sent from New Plymouth and the Bellblock Redoubt to support the attack on the pa. On the 24th, Nelson received a message from Hapuruna. "Unfortunately, we only have this message third hand," Hapuruna told the Reverend Whiteley, who decided he was too busy to talk to the Major, so instead told a Sergeant Marjoram, who passed it on to Nelson. Hapuruna requested him to give his compliments to the officer commanding the troops at Waitara, and he was very much obliged to the soldiers for expending a little ammunition on their party yesterday. But he is not quite ready to fight yet, and in the future he intends to keep a white flag flying, and he expected the officer commanding to do the same at the camp. and it was to be understood that while their flags were flying, no fighting would take place. But if any of the soldiers fired upon any of the Maoris, he would consider us to be taking unfair advantage, and in that case he should know how to act. Mr. Whiteley also stated that it was his opinion the natives were not yet prepared to make much resistance, but in 2 or 3 days' time their plans would be complete. It is unwise to read too much into this since it passed through so many people before arriving at Nelson, but it does suggest that Haparona would deny the account of the recon party of the previous day. He doesn't describe it as a skirmish or firefight, but instead as a one-sided expending of ammunition. He also seems to perceive it as an offensive act, the British trying to start a fight that Te Awamutu were not yet ready for. Unfortunately for Haparona, the British commanders were not so chivalrous as to wait for their opponents to ready themselves for battle. The next day, Nelson lowered the white ensign that had been flying over Camp Waitara and raised the Union Jack and awaited the word from Colonel Gold to go on the offensive. Haparona and the other Maori do not seem to have taken the hint from the lowering of the white flag, because when the Imperial forces attacked the next day, most of the potential defenders were some distance away in villages upriver of the battlefield. Less than 200 people defended the fortifications, mostly Te Awamutu, although there was a significant group of Ngāti Maniapoto present. Against this, Nelson attacked with 350 soldiers and 2 24-pounder howitzers. Nelson's plan was relatively straightforward. He would command the main force consisting of 180 soldiers and the howitzers, and would attack Puketakauere over open ground from the northwest. A smaller force of 125 soldiers would flank the pa from the east, moving along the ridgeline and attacking down from the summit of Puketakauere. This force was commanded by Captain Messenger and consisted of soldiers from the Grenadiers and Light Companies of the 40th Regiments. The Grenadiers were the strongest and most skilled soldiers of the regiment in short-range combat, while the Light Company contained the best marksmen. So despite its small size, this detachment was quite powerful. The final part of this force was positioned between the two main forces, to prevent any attempt by the defenders to escape in that direction, and also to defend the British camp should Haparona launch a surprise attack. This was planned to be a dawn attack, and the British troops, particularly Messengers, would have a difficult march to make in the dark. Fortunately for Messenger, he had Ihaya Te Kilukumura as a guide to lead his forces into position. At 7 a.m. the sun rose, and Nelson ordered his artillery to begin firing on the pa from 400 yards away. The artillery managed to do some damage to the palisade, and Nelson soon ordered his infantry to attack the breach that had been created. However, Haparona did not make his main line of resistance behind the palisade, but instead his warriors had created hidden entrenchments in a natural depression in front of the pa. The British forces were advancing over open ground when they came under fire from an enemy that they could not clearly see, but was at very close range. At Wairika, the battle was fought at long range, which suited the more accurate British rifles. However, the lower quality weapons that the Maori tended to use delivered a faster rate of fire and were therefore more effective at close range than the British weapons. The British advance halted in the face of this fire. Nelson started to get his soldiers moving forward again, but more Te Awamutu warriors came out of the pa and joined the firing line in the trenches, and this extra firepower was enough to stop the British advance again. But Nelson knew that he still had a chance. When Messenger arrived in the enemy's rear, this battle could still be won, so his soldiers held their position and returned fire. Unfortunately for Nelson, though, Messenger's detachment had even greater problems. The night march had been difficult, and they had only reached their starting positions as the heavy artillery began firing. Unrested, his soldiers immediately advanced on Puketakauere, which was assumed to be undefended since there was no palisade. But this was not the case. There were a number of trenches and rifle pits which contained a sizable number of Maori from both Ngāti Maniapoto and Te Awamutu. The attack initially did well thanks to the surprise of the dawn attack, but as Maori reinforcements arrived from both Onukukaitara Pa and the warriors that had been in villages to the rear at the start of the battle, Messenger's force began to be surrounded. Seeing the danger, Messenger got together the nearest 30 or 40 soldiers and attacked down the ridge towards Nelson's position. This group managed to break out of the encirclement, but Nelson had already decided to withdraw as his force was running low on ammunition, and there had been no sign of an attack from Puketakauere. Messenger did not think he could do anything to prevent the bulk of his soldiers that remained on the top of the ridge from being overrun, so he followed Nelson back to camp. Other groups and individuals would return to Camp Waitara over the course of the day, but almost a third of the soldiers Messenger led up to Puketakauere died or were wounded there. Over the 4.5 hours of fighting, 29 British soldiers died and 33 were wounded, a number of whom later died as a result. On the other side, 5 Maori died in the fighting, a figure which settlers found hard to believe. The newspapers reported that British forces had been fighting against 800 to 1,000 Maori and had caused between 100 and 150 casualties, but there were no substance to these reports. Hapurono continued to hold his pa and set about strengthening the two positions now that his traps had been found out, alongside burying the British dead. This was a clear and significant defeat for the Imperial forces, and immediately efforts were made to distribute the blame. In Nelson's report, he commends most of his officers for their actions, although Messenger's name was absent from this list. Colonel Gold went a bit further and made it clear to the governor that he had not ordered the attack, but had only instructed Nelson to act at his discretion. He also followed Nelson's lead in not thanking Messenger for his conduct during the battle. Unfortunately for Gold, Nelson and Messenger were both popular officers and were believed by the settlers to be the kind of aggressive commanders that were needed to win the war. Gold did not fit this description. To make matters worse for the colonial war effort, on the same day as the Battle of Puketakauere, Taranaki Iwi and Ngāti Ranui attacked Tairomaka, the far west of the government's positions. The soldiers guarding the area retreated after a short firefight and the Pākehā houses and other property was burnt. Although no casualties had been taken at Tairomaka, it contributed to the sense that the British Empire was losing this war, and Gore Brown decided that a new commander was needed. Major General Pratt was requested from Australia to take command, and Colonel Gold was redirected to other duties. This makes for a good pausing point in discussing the course of the war. The British had an overwhelming numerical superiority, but they had failed to turn it into a significant military victory. Twice Hapurono had defeated the government forces at Waitara, and 6 Pākehā had been killed for every Maori death to the east of New Plymouth. West of New Plymouth, the government had won a victory at Waireka, but this had only kept the Taranaki Iwi and Ngāti Ranui on the defensive for a short time. The burning of Te Tairomaka demonstrated that Taranaki and Ngāti Ranui had recovered from that defeat and were capable of going on the offensive again. In fact, over the next weeks, they again began entrenching themselves around Waireka to put greater pressure on the Omata stockade and New Plymouth itself. After 4 months of fighting and a death of 38 Pākehā and 25 to 35 Maori in combat, the position was exactly the same as it had been at the start of the war. Te Ātiawa would have been justified in being satisfied at how the war was going. However, Kingi still refused to take offensive action against the settlers and opposed any ambushes and raids east of New Plymouth. Taranaki and Ngāti Ranui to the west were feasting and celebrating the capture of Te Tairomaka and keen to go back on the offensive. Meanwhile, disease was spreading through New Plymouth. The four-man family had 3 children and their mother die of illness within a few weeks. The government started forcing large families to evacuate to Nelson, but the situation was still difficult for the besieged settlers.